I'm just going to talk about materials. Now, on one of the courses recently, one of the people stopped me that was on the course. In fact, I think it was the one Emma was at, and she said, but I was talking about bearings. And she said, excuse me, but what is a bearing? And I think, well, why would they know? Why would they know? They're coming from a different background. So then sort of diverted and talked about bearings for 10, 15 minutes or whatever. And I became aware at that point that there's a lot of very simple, straightforward stuff that people just don't know. And it does sound a bit dumbed down, and I don't mean it to be. Just throw things at me if you think I'm trying to insult your intelligence or anything. But so yeah, let's see. So this is the engine room of a steamship, which is made of the loch. Now, I always tell people what they should actually do is develop X-ray vision and look at an object or look at a collection of objects or materials. And we're looking at one out there, and try and identify in your head. I know it sounds a bit sad, but try and identify in your head all the materials that you're looking at. And think about what's behind the wall or what's behind the bulkhead or whatever, and train yourself to think in that way. Obviously, we've got I'll make sure I press the right one. Yeah, we've got cast iron there, and the engine entablature. We've got steel forgings in the crankshaft. We've got aluminium in the foot plates. We've got tubular steel. We've got bronze in the bearings. We've got riveted steel plates. So all these materials come together to make the object. And until you start to, either instinctively through experience, even from archives, you find out what the materials are and what they're likely to be because of the age of the ship, then that gives you a good clue. Discovery is exactly the same thing. It's actually a big package of wood held together with metal straps and nails, and some of it not held together very well now, which we hope to kind of remedy over the next year. So understanding, don't just look at an object and think, yeah, it's a ship's engine room. It's not, it's a collection of engineered parts that go to make up the larger object. So there's lots of, these are the kind of materials you come across, obviously, on the left there. And Emma was talking about her work earlier on, working with leather, woods, iron, steel, bronze alloys. Bronze alloys is always a difficult one. I'm calling it a bronze alloy, but it's actually a copper alloy. So it's something you'll come across a lot on conservation projects on, say, things like steam engines or other engineered objects where you've got rotating parts running in bearings. That word again. So the mix of the copper alloy is usually called a bronze, but there's all sorts of different bronzes, and they've all got all sorts of different duties. So to really understand what that alloy should be, you really need to know what the duty is, its history, and how it was identified at the time, because it will be identified differently nowadays. For example, the ship, the Discovery, I was almost shining the pointer on the ship, but there's a non-magnetic zone in the center of the ship, which helped with navigation, so it wouldn't foul up the instruments and whatever. So there's lots of bronze used in the center of the ship. Some of the brackets basically that hold the decks up off the frames of the hull are made in bronze. Knees is the proper term. You've got to learn all the nautical terms. So they're made out of bronze. They'll be phosphor bronze, probably. But the nails and the fastenings that hold the ship together are made from silicon bronze. So slightly different mix. And it's not a very big element, the added element, it's mostly copper. But copper changes miraculously when you add small amounts of other metals or non-metals sometimes as well. So So research and the ship's history, or the object's history, and how they interact together is important. You know, it's if you put steel fastenings through the side of a ship, they'll react with certain timbers or react with oak. For example, oak's high in tannic acid and it attacks the metal parts. I mean, even it can destroy lead. You know, we've known that for a while. And the grade of the material, it just is literally a can of worms. And of course, the bottom one's the all-important one is the environment that the object is in. Discovery suffered probably more in Dundee and on the Thames than it ever did in Antarctica, although probably if it was only there for a very short part of its life. But the environment, because it's mostly fresh rainwater that's falling on it, doesn't agree with timber very well at all. Shipwrecks, wooden shipwrecks, we think about the Vasa and the Mary Rose, where they've been submerged for hundreds of years in salt water. So that has a preservative effect. Here, all we've got is rainwater falling on the decks and running through the ships, and it's basically rotting it away. So we've got all sorts of fungal stuff going on and wet rot. And if anybody wants to have a look later on, we'll show you a good example, or a couple of good examples. So this is the good case in point, and I'll talk about it a bit more. This is Verdant Works up the road. And you can see over on the right there is the Bolton and Watt engine. And I think this is the Early Engines Conference that's coming up at Summerlee. Oh, someone is going to be speaking about that, I believe. John Crompton is going to be talking about that. No, yes, he is going to be talking about that engine, because I've had a debate about him. I think it's the most original Bolton and Watt engine. He says it isn't. That's all right. But he's a know-it-all anyway. He's a nice guy, though. But anyway, one of the problems with that building is when we came to look at it, basically the water was just pouring through the roof, and the building was completely sodden. The engine had been in a museum store, Dundee Council Museum store, and it was very dry. Museum stores are notorious because the environment, the relative humidity, has got to suit all sorts of different objects of different materials. And of course, wood dries out very quickly, becomes quite desiccated. And if you look at that engine, you'll see the rocking beam. Press the right one. Yeah, the rocking beam is oak. I was really quite concerned about it because it was so dry. Anyway, we had a long discussion about it and decided to go for it because there's quite a lot of stress on it when it's operating. Although it's not driving anything, it still has to work. It has to pivot over a central bearing, and it's got a big counterweight at one end, so all that's causing quite a bit of stress. Anyway, the point is the wood, which was very dry, had to take on moisture because it was in a new environment, and the building was very, very wet, and it had to dry out. So there was an exchange going on, and the kind of serendipitous effect, if you like, is that the engine became wet more slowly. It took on water more slowly because it had been already dried. The same engine that we did in the National Museum in Chambers Street was in the opposite direction because it was all green timber we used, and the building is very controlled humidity-wise, and it was all over the place. The timber was splitting and fracturing, and we used a couple of years before it settled down and stabilized. So two projects very similar but completely different because of the environment. So the environment's really important. So yeah, cast metals, understanding cast metals. Even domestic items. We all know that a skillet or a frying pan, they're heavy, unless it's cast aluminium, of course. But mostly the good ones are cast iron. And never buy it with non-stick on it, by the way, there's carcinogenic. But if you get a skillet, you can season it. You get a proper iron skillet, you can season it, and don't put it in the dishwasher. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with this. But anyway, cast metals, it's recognizing them as the thing. Now, you can tell a pot that you would use domestically has been either pressed, it's been made out of pressed steel, or it's been machined. But you can see that they've been made, or you should be able to see, use your kind of deductive process, and you can see it's been made in a mold. So it's been cast into a mold. So it's got that kind of rounded shape, a kind of almost slightly organic look to it, and that's the kind of sign of a casting. So yeah, look at them when you see them and think, oh, that's cast iron. You go to lift it and it's heavy, that's cast iron. If it comes up like that, it's cast aluminium. If you've got a kind of traditional office building and you're looking at, have a look at your radiators. So one of them is pressed steel and the other one's cast iron. So what one's a cast iron one? Yeah. It looks like a casting, doesn't it? It's not been assembled from parts, it's a single casting, and a very clever casting. Just a radiator, you think, but it's a very clever casting. So the one on the left is trying to kind of copy it in a way, trying to look traditional, but it's not quite there. But again, it's just looking at something and thinking about it when you're looking at it. Like the structure of this building, you know, what's it made out of? I can't help myself. So, yeah. So cast iron has got its disadvantages. It doesn't handle stress very well, and that stress can be heat and being used on the wrong type of cooker, for example, in that case. Now, the gates up in the top left there, some people, if you're walking down the street and you see a lovely ornamental gate and you say, well, that's a lovely piece of wrought ironwork. I'll kill you if you're ever with me if you say that. It's not wrought ironwork. Wrought iron is a material, not a finished object. And people think wrought means worked, which it does, and they think it means turned into a shape, but that's not what it means. It means you've taken iron, which is the same. Wrought iron's basically the same metallurgically as cast iron, but it's wrought, it's worked. In Scotland, the old word is rocht, W-R-O-C-H-T, which is, if somebody's hard rocht, they've been hard worked. So it's been hard worked to create the material, not the finished object. And we'll come to that. So, and these are three engineered objects. I'm getting kind of technical now. One of them is a casting in steel, one is a casting in aluminium, and one is a machined steel object. Now, they've all been machined, and I can tell you, I'm not going to ask you difficult questions, but basically, that's a block of steel. It's a steel ingot that's been machined in every direction. You can tell by you see that sort of gramophone effect? That's because the machine has actually gone from the outside and machined into the center. So it's a very fine spiral. So that tells you how it's been machined. The edges have been milled because you can see the lines. So it's been done in a milling machine. And the holes are obviously bored. But the big holes have been done in a boring machine, not in a drill. So just stuff like that, but you can learn by looking at an object. I started off as an engineering apprentice before I kind of did other things, but you learn the hard way because you're seeing all these things being made and machined. As it happens, the one in the top left is actually cast iron. And the reason that you know it's cast iron is that it machines differently. It's got a grey look to it. So, and it machines very easily. Cast iron's quite hard, but it machines really easily because it's a good conductor of heat. That's why we use cast iron for frying pans. The one on the right is cast aluminium, and then it was machined. And aluminium, lots of different grades of aluminium, but it's always brighter. It's always got a brighter colour to it. This is getting really sad, but this is the cuttings that come off different materials when you machine them. So the one in the bottom left is cast iron. The one in the top left is steel, but it's been taken off using a really heavy cut. So the tool in the lathe, if you like, is what they call, it's a chipping tool. It takes chunks of metal off. But one of them goes down the front of your shirt. Boy, do you know all about it. The one on the right that's a lathe that's taking very fine cuts. So the steel comes off in spirals. So cast iron would never come off in a spiral. It always comes off as a dust almost. Don't ask me why the coin's there. No idea. So cast iron has got a lot of great uses. Ornamental cast iron in the 19th century was the new wonder material. It was the plastic of its time. The fountain, this is the fountain we restored in Paisley on the right. That was made by the Sun Foundry in Glasgow, George Smith and Sons. They did really kind of over-the-top ornamental ironwork, and it was the colouring was done by a guy called Daniel Cotier, who was a colourist. He called himself a colourist, and he was into kind of highly stylized stuff and really bright kind of colours. In fact, he painted a lot of the church interiors for Greek Thompson. He did a lot of friezes and whatever in his houses and churches. The one on the left is from the same foundry. It's up in the necropolis in Glasgow, but it's in a sorry state. I went and did a report on that for the Friends of the Necropolis, and I got this certificate with a big dead angel in front of it. I was like, for helping them. I thought, do I really want this? Anyway, the colouring for the fountain was taken from samples that we took. We took paint samples. A lot of it was lost in the bottom because the council had just council green, it was just painted council white and council green sort of thing. But anyway, we went to a lot of trouble with the colour. Now, this is an interesting kind of point of view on this is we're talking about doing things in the traditional way. You can't do cast iron, or you can't finish it in a traditional way anymore. It's far too expensive, and it won't last. The paints that were used originally, what they did was when the casting came out of the mould, it was still hot, and they basically threw linseed oil over the top of the casting, and that just flashed off and soaked into the surface of the iron. But that gave you a key for the next layers of linseed oil-based paints. But because the pigments were all organic pigments usually, they didn't last. The sun just faded them after a few years. So the money nowadays in painting an object like that is all in the labour. The materials are expensive, but it's nothing compared to the labour. So when you are going to decorate them or coat them, you're going to do it with the most expensive, best known products you can get. And that's basically what that's been done with a 2-pack polyurethane system with metal particles added and all sorts. But we did try and do it the way Cotier did it. But I think that exemplifies, I know we're talking about materials, but we are talking about coatings as well. The walruses had all lost their tusks and their masks, and they were all put to, there's a great pattern maker if you're ever needing patterns. There's a lady called Ruth Davis who lives in Paisley. If you ever need patterns made or anything ornamental, she's the best pattern maker in Scotland, without a doubt, bar none. In fact, one of the only ones actually. But she did all the replacement, the patterns for all the parts that had to be replaced. And the reason that the walruses are there was not for any kind of environmental kind of reason, but basically the guy that sponsored the fountains called Coates of Paisley, who was the thread manufacturer, he used to like to shoot them. So I thought that was quite nostalgic to have 4 walruses on the fountain that he paid for. Different world. Anyway. Yeah, wrought iron. So, as I say, wrought iron is called wrought iron because it's worked. So you roll it as a plate or roll it into bars. So you're constantly changing the molecular structure of the iron. What you do with wrought iron is, I say, you work the iron until it's all the structure in the metal is all lying in the same direction. And the best sort of analogy is the Blackpool rock, where you've got the lettering running through the rock. If you look at the one in the bottom right, I'm afraid to touch the buttons now. The one in the bottom right is a piece of wrought iron bar that's been cut halfway through and then broken. And you can see that fibrous appearance. But what else is important is if you look at the piece on the right, if you look at it closely, you'll see lots of little black dots. And that's, if you cut a piece of steel, you won't see that. But if you cut a piece of iron, you will see that. And it's basically the slag in the wrought iron. And it's the slag that gives it its strength. It's a bit like fiberglass and fiberglass resin. You can make a fishing rod out of fiberglass, but it's fiberglass strands in a resin, and it's the strands of fiberglass that give it the strength, and it's the same in wrought iron. It's the strands of a carbon and slag, as they call it, in the iron. The same things happened with the one at the top left. That's exactly the same process. That's been cut and then partially cut and then broken. So wrought iron was the poor man's steel in a way. When steel was a very, very expensive thing to make, wrought iron was a substitute. And there was a period from transition from wooden ships to steel ships. In between there was iron ships. It was a very, very short window, because if an iron ship runs onto the rocks, it breaks, because cast iron is very much like glass. I always think about, if you're handling cast iron, think about glass, because it shatters. So an iron ship running onto the rocks doesn't last very long. But that's the kind of hallmark of wrought iron. Yeah, and if you look at these, good examples. The chain in the top right is a steel chain, because you can see the pitting in it. So that's basically telling you it's corroding evenly, and from the outside through pitting. A steel will pit. The chain on the bottom right is wrought iron, and when it starts to corrode, it looks like wood almost. It's got that kind of striated effect, like wood grain almost. So that's a dead giveaway. The anchor up on the top is interesting in that the stock of the anchor and whatever is made there. The cross piece, if you like, at the top is wrought iron. The bottom piece is a forging, and the chain is wrought iron. But you can tell all that just by looking at the way it's corroded. So it saves a lot of time if you just learn to recognise what you're actually looking at. Now, the cast iron railings down there, and you'll see this a lot. Basically, the bottom parts, it's a wee bit too close actually, but the bottom part's the casting. So you've got the ornamental part. You've got a capping rail on the top, which is cast iron, and that overlaps and staggers the joints between the panels. But what they did was they put a wrought iron strap underneath the capping rail to give it a bit of strength. But the wrought iron, when it corrodes, it expands at a much greater rate than the cast iron, and it fractures and knocks the cast iron off in lumps, as you can see. So that's one to look next time you're walking around an old cemetery or whatever and looking at the railings, or in the West End of Glasgow or whatever. You'll see a lot of that. So what do you think that's made out of? Another one you got at home. This is the real one. Yeah, it's actually wrought iron. It's the biggest wrought iron structure in the world. Eiffel wouldn't use steel because they didn't trust it. But if you think about, every part of that was rolled and hammered, and yeah, quite something. Right. So when you I hope none of you have got one of these gates in front of your drive. This is what people that call themselves blacksmiths and who aren't make these things on the right, and it is so badly. It's not even a good example. It's so badly made. But that gate on the left is made out of wrought iron, and it is a wrought iron gate. But it's, as I say, it's the material that matters. There's lots of rapoussia work in there, where you've got little panels that are hammered and shaped and put together. So there's probably there might be some castings at the bottom of the pillars, but that's about all. You won't forget that now, will you? This is an iron ship, and you can tell that if you look at the plates on the inside, they're very small, because that's the size. It's only the size they could. The technology at the time allowed them to make that size, and they're riveted together. Riveting wrought iron is quite difficult. Wrought iron behaves like steel, but not quite as good as it, and it can actually shatter. So you've got to rivet it without breaking it. And apparently they had to bring riveters down from someplace up on the River Clyde to put that together, when there wasn't much shipbuilding happening in the Clyde. But they were brought down to Bristol to build the SS Great Britain. But you can see the way it corrodes. It's not good, but it did last. It lay in the Falklands, as you know, for many decades, and it did last longer than it would have done if it had been a steel ship. So in some ways, there's swings and roundabouts. This is one that always makes me smile. They've got a controlled environment, allegedly, in the dry dock that it was built in, and it doesn't work. Because the water's just pouring out the walls of the dry dock. Not like the dry dock here that's all lined in concrete. Right. So yeah, again, steel, we'll know what it's used for. That's basically a steam boiler that's been made. That's Cochrane's boilers down the border. It machines up quite nicely, as you can see the cuttings on the cover plate there, and we use it for everything. And there's so many different types of steel now. Some earlier steels had lots of problems, but we'll talk about. So that panel is from the Titanic. Now, there was a major problem there where they've analysed some of the rivets, and there's lots of conspiracy theories about the Titanic, but the rivets didn't stand up to low temperatures very well. So once they started to pop, when it hit the iceberg, the rivets didn't behave very well, and neither did the steel. Probably a modern ship hitting the same iceberg might have done a bit better, but it's one of these points you could debate forever. Yeah. Yes. So basically, there is any metal object, especially ships, because they're built out of such light, in such light gauges, and if they're in fresh water, it's even lighter. But you're talking about a modern cruise ship, say, having something like 10 to 12 millimeters maximum hull thickness, and it's not a lot when you think about it. But you're depending on the quality of the steel, which is much better these days, but they still don't do well hitting rocks and things. So coatings are important, very important, but preparation, just like if you're doing the woodwork in your house, it's the preparation to the woodwork that matters. Putting the last coat of paint on is almost like an afterthought. The finish is not important really. It's what the preparation is everything, and it's the same with steel. preparation, and iron. So yeah, you've got all these issues, and God help people in museums in Scotland that are trying to keep things preserved. So a museum controlled environment, yeah, one size doesn't fit all. A gallery with paintings in it should be at a different RH level than where an engineered object is stored, or a timber object, and so on. So different environments for different objects. Storage sheds can be a nightmare. If you may have a roof over it and it helps a bit, but it's still not a good environment. Outside, poor old Discovery, basically, is suffering. So I'm just seeing what they're taking off the boat now. It's a lump of very rotten wood. Oh dear. Salt air affects steel and iron quite a lot, but it's actually really good for wood. Wood doesn't like a freshwater environment. Rain is basically a freshwater environment. And all the Discovery gets nowadays is rain. Even once they come to flood the dry dock, when this work's finished and the ship's afloat again, the water out the Tay, they'll need to do saline tests on it to make sure when they flood the dry dock, there's enough salt in the water to do the business. The Tay is the fastest runoff river in Europe, allegedly. So it's mostly fresh water. Even down here, it's quite brackish at that point. So you have to raise the salinity level, or they will. And they may have to add salt to the water that the ship's been floating in. And obviously, the other thing is that I would have suggested that they put sprays, mist sprays over the ship, so that at night when the visitors are all gone, there's just a mist coming over the ship with salt water. Talk to you later about that. Yeah. So if something's well enclosed and well encapsulated, that's a steering gear from an old ship, and it's in perfect condition because it was enclosed and locked together. There was some condensation or moisture had been in the air when it was all closed up, and there's little spots of corrosion just here and there, but it's remarkably good condition because of the environment it was in. And that's needle roller bearings, and that is in the 1930s, so nothing's new. Well, not many things anyway. That's a good example of a bad environment. This was before, this is the Scapa Flow Museum, as it's now called, up in Orkney. A fabulous place. If you've not been, go, because it's just been reopened and it's superb. But Arles, east end of Glasgow, built all these big oil storage tanks just before the war, when the new war was coming. And I think there was a tank farm, about 20 of these big tanks. And these are riveted steel, they're massive. And the steel's something like just over about 30 millimeters thick at the bottom, and then it gets smaller as it goes up. But the roof is a magnificent structure inside. But the roof designed so that if a bomb hits the roof, it goes in and explodes and goes up the way and takes the roof with it and leaves the tank intact. But from a conservation point of view, it's a nightmare because, well, we know what the Orkney weather can be like. And when you put the lights out in that building, it's looking up at a starry sky. Anyway, they had lots of objects in it, and you couldn't have picked a worse place to store these objects. They've all been taken out now, but that's the only tank that's left, and that's the old oil pumping station there. It's worth a visit. There's a lot of good stuff in there now. Obviously, all the Scapa Flow wrecks, there's lots of bits and pieces off the wrecks there. But yeah, again, that roof will need to be replaced, basically. Yeah, and that's, going back to I kind of jumped the gun a bit telling you the story about the two different buildings, but that's the Douglasfield engine that's up in Verdant Works. In among the structure, the original mill building structure, the yellow and grey columns are actually the original structure, so it had to be assembled in among that structure, which was a complete nightmare. But it's one of the only engines that have the original steam jacket on the cylinder. So instead of insulation in these days, they used a steam jacket because coal was cheap, and you could the steam heated the jacket of the engine and kept it warm. So anyway, never mind. Anyway, if you look at the one on the left, it's interesting too. This isn't about materials, but it was about when Watt built that engine, the crankshaft was patented. So basically, he couldn't have a crankshaft. So the connecting rod off the beam had to be connected in a different way to the drive shaft. So he came up with this idea called the sun and planet gear mechanism, where the connecting rod just rolls around the central gear, and means that the shaft output is twice the speed of the engine speed. So it's quite clever. But anyway, that was in a local mill. 1801, I think it is it? Thereabouts. So we think about bronze as being a modern high-tech material. Of course, it isn't. It could be worked at relatively low temperatures and still can be. If you can make a little forge in your garden if you fancy it, or in your museum forecourt, so you don't burn the place down. But you can smelt aluminium, and you can build a little mini smelter. Kids love it, things like that. So they can bring their empty aluminium cans and smelt them and mold them and cast them. It's a good sort of educational tool. So you add all these different metals. If you add them in different amounts to copper, it does a completely different job. So the earlier forms of bronze were obviously a mixture of copper and tin, because they were too easily found ores and easily mined and easily smelted. Bearings, so you add certain metals to copper to give you good bearing material that self-lubricates. Things like zinc and phosphorus and all sorts. Anyway. So it's a lovely material, and it patinates beautifully. The one red herring in there is the coins down on the right that we don't use very much nowadays, do we? But they're actually steel. Modern coins or copper coins are steel, and they're basically coated, they're plated in copper. So if you see when people throw coins into fountains, you'll see the rusty mark when they're picked up, because they're actually steel. Oh, it's getting too technical for me. I don't even remember writing half that stuff. So there's a material up in the top left there, and it's sintered bronze. It's impregnated with different metals, and it self-lubricates. And you can recognize it with all the little dots in it. So the bearing in the top right is quite modern, quite a high-tech bearing. You can just tell with the machining quality and whatever, and obviously that it's well lubricated, because the shaft that's running in the bearing has not been destroyed. Whereas in the bottom left, that's much older, a bit more crude, and you can see the lines in the bearing. Now that could just be dirty oil. It could be all sorts of different things. And over in the bottom right is a very traditional bronze bearing. They tend to be cast and then machined, because if you machined that from a solid, it'd be very expensive because of the amount of metal you'd have to lose. So moving quickly on. So this is what they call white metal, and if you have a car, you've got white metal bearings in your crankshaft in your car, and it's basically any kind of carrier metal with a bearing surface laid onto the top of it. And it used to be called Babbitt metal. So it's a mixture of lead and tin laid onto the carrier material. And there can be other metals like antimony in it and whatever. So these are typical car bearings in the bottom left there. If the oil supply dries up or stops, that bearing is gone in seconds. It's gone because the shaft runs on the film of oil. It doesn't run on the bearing. And if the oil disappears, it's onto the bearing, and the bearing is white, as they call it, which means that basically there's no white metal left. You can basically scratch that metal almost with your fingernail. Depends on how long your fingernails are, of course. But yeah, the tools over on the right are bearing scrapers. Now, if you can find someone who can use these bearing scrapers, you know you've found a very old engineer, because they're not hand scraped anymore. They're all made because of the high levels of precision in machinery nowadays. We don't need to scrape bearings anymore. But if you have an old steam engine in your collection, anyway, that's another story. But basically, if it has white metal bearings, they have to be hand scraped when they're fitted. So that's quite a skill. Yeah, so there's more bauxite than any other ore on Earth, but the qualities in aluminium are many and varied, and they're used for all sorts. People think aircraft are built out of aluminium. They kind of are, but it's an aluminium alloy, and that's a good example of a World War II fighter aircraft made completely in aluminium. Probably one of the first ones. It was a Mustang, I think. Yeah. Oh, organic materials, leathers. Emma was talking about earlier on, are quite difficult to work with. You've got to be really careful how you treat them, and you can ruin them quite easily. Yeah, because they're subject to mold and all sorts of different things. Blacksmith shops are a good example where you've got bellows made out of leather, and of course they're subject to all sorts of different fungal growths. When they're being used, there's no problem because they're being used and they're being worked every day, and you treat them with something called neat's foot oil, which is basically a kind of organic oil that's taken from animals' feet and rubbed into the even shoe polish works on leather if it's a bellows or whatever. But yes, anything that puts natural oils back into the material. And of course, we talk about rubber tires, which aren't rubber anymore, and car museums have that problem. There's now synthetic material to look like rubber, dyed black because that's what we expect it to look like. All these, it's a nightmare, it's a complete nightmare trying to work out what a material is before you actually try to treat it. Timber's a big issue for me because of this just now, but I'm fascinated by it. And it's not just the species, it's where it grows. And I was saying to someone earlier on that there's a timber in here. When the ship was built, one of the timbers that was specified for the kind of pine work is Riga fir. Now, Riga fir is a tree called Pinus sylvestris, which is basically Scots pine. If it grows in Scandinavia or Finland, the timber yards call it Scandinavian redwood. If it's grown, so where it's grown, you've got the timber industry call woods different things than the kind of botanical names. So it's a real nightmare. The other thing is, if anybody goes to the ship, I'll show them the timber that had been taken out of the steering box at the back, and it was repaired in the 90s, and they've used Douglas fir. Now, Douglas fir is a great timber if it's grown in Canada, but if it's grown in Scotland, no use because it grows far too fast. The grain is far too separated, and it's got quite low resin content, because nature makes the tree produce more resin the further north it grows to protect the tree so that the tree doesn't freeze all the way through in the winter, because the tree will just burst basically if it freezes. So there's more resin in if you buy the timber from further north. So the repairs we'll do to this will be with Scandinavian redwood. Riga fir is basically the same wood, but just from the other side of the Baltic. So basically, the further north you can get it from, the better. You never ever use anything if you're doing a timber project like this, never use anything that's been grown in Scotland unless it's a hardwood. Oak or elm or ash or whatever, fine, but not softwoods. And oak's going to be a problem. We're going to have to use French oak for quite a bit of it, because there's some of the parts are long, have to be long and straight and regular. So French oak is farmed and it grows tall and straight. It's exactly the same species as native oak, so don't think it's inferior in any way. But again, if it grows further north in France, it's better than the stuff from southern France for this kind of purpose. A big problem with if you're working with hardwoods and you've got volunteers or people working with hardwoods, really make sure that they're well kitted up, and not just the 5-bulb dust mask out of B&Q. If you're working with hardwoods, a proper mask with the replaceable cartridges on it, because the dust is so fine that it is carcinogenic. So be very careful. Same with splinters. Splinters off hardwood will always, if you get a splinter, it'll go poisonous. It won't kill you, but it's not very nice. It always goes poisonous. I've never known it to do otherwise. So if you're working with woods like Opepe or Greenheart, but tropical hardwoods are the ones you've got to watch. Any hardwood, oak or native hardwoods, dust masks, but be careful. Doesn't mean they're not asbestos, so don't run a mile. You know, use them, but use them sensibly and carefully. Asbestos is a whole other story, but I won't go there. Yep, so, okay. Yeah, this is an example. This is a good, there's nobody here from the lottery fund, is there? The carriageway in the Balloch Slipway, this is an A-listed building, so it's up there with cathedrals and all the rest of it. That was rebuilt, we rebuilt that back in the, when was it now? 2024, I think it was. And the lottery monitor insisted, because it originally had been built in pitch pine, he said, "Oh, I'll have to go back in a pine because an A-listed structure, da-da-da." I said, "Well, we can't get pitch pine anymore." "Oh, well, and let's another pine, Douglas fir." "No, don't go there, don't go there, please don't go there." Anyway, they insisted. That lasted less than, 20 years, less than 20 years. And they taking the ship out of the water and the thing broke up as we were taking it out. And it was basically just because all the metal fastenings that would go through it had absorbed water, the water penetration into the centre of the wood, and the material just broke up. It's been redone, and it's been done, and I've got to say, Historic Environment Scotland bent over backwards to help us with it. Apart from funding it, they also allowed us to play quite a wide game with the A-listed status. But the new one, that was it after it failed, and that was after less than 20 years, Douglas fir. Now, so don't use Douglas fir if it's outside. And that's the new one. Now, the new one's built in galvanised steel, but there's timber on the bottom. You can just see it on the far side. You can see it's actually Greenheart, which is a very dense wood. It's got a high specific gravity. It actually doesn't float. So we'll use Greenheart on the hull on Discovery. But all the bogies underneath, there's hundreds of bogies underneath it, they're all original. And all the black and white painted parts are all original. So that let us through the A-listing process. And as I say, they bent over backwards to allow us to do it, and gave us £90,000 towards it as well. So that's basically it, folks. Sorry I've rabbited on for quite a while, but